right. Hello. Welcome to the Stump, a podcast about forestry and other topics that I find of interest. Today we have joining us Trevor McConchie. I've known Trevor for quite a few years. Used to work together and still do, just not within the same organization. And he's very heavily engaged in the Good Neighbor Authority program here in Washington. And I felt like this would be a very interesting and timely topic. So, welcome, Trevor.
Hi, glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So, I just thought we'd start a little bit, Trevor, with a little bit of your background. How'd you get into forestry? What's kind of your career path, and then we can transition into the Good Neighbor Authority program.
Sure, yeah, I my career path has been one that I think at a certain point mimics a lot of people in natural resources where you go to school for forestry and then you go through the seasonal sort of work to build some work experience, then hopefully you can get a permanent job. But my actually like the very, very, very beginning of my interest in just trees in general, actually started with maple syrup. And that was actually when I was in high school. I worked for a sugaring operation in the Northeast. And I'll always remember it. It was this one day I was just looking at this like sugar bush of sugar maples. And I asked the farmer, I was like, can we do something to like make these make more sap? Like, is there something that we can do to the trees? And he looked at me and he goes, I believe the term you're looking for is a thing called silviculture. I have no idea what that is, but I think that's what you're talking about. And I was like, huh, silviculture. Okay. And I kind of tucked that away. And then I uh I went to the University of New Hampshire for about a year and a half, and I actually started as a undeclared liberal arts major because I had no idea what I wanted to do. And then I sat in that room and I looked around and I said, raised my hand and I said, "Hi, can you send me to the sciences? Because I'd like to go over that way." And then when they go through and said, pick out stuff that's of interest of you, I saw this forestry thing and I was like, what? Oh, that sounds kind of cool. So ended up going into that and actually got really heavily involved in New England, in particular New Hampshire. The cooperative extension program within the universities is a pretty strong place for forestry. It's I call it kind of the happy, fuzzy, fluffy side of forestry. It's just talks about a lot of the good work that can be done. And so I glommed onto that and I thought I wanted to be an extension forester as I kind of got going. But then during my schooling, I learned like about the West, basically. I'd never been out West in my sort of younger years. And um, my advisor was like, yeah, you need to go to like Oregon and Montana, go check out some of that stuff. And I was like, okay. So got on a plane, flew over, did some college interviews, and lo and behold, I transferred to the University of Montana. And that was like one of the best moves I could have ever made. And so I spent a bunch of time in Montana and Idaho and Washington and a little bit of Oregon and also British Columbia through my college career. Ended up finishing up and graduating, and I went to work in actually in private industry as my first sort of real job out of school for the Collins Pine Company down in Lakeview, Oregon. And kind of like, that was a big shift coming from your college version of what forestry is to you're supplying logs to a mill. And that is a very, 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 um, there's a lot of weight on your shoulders when you're in that sort of role. So, but I was so young, I didn't really know what that all meant. I just knew this was like pretty hardcore level of work and expectation. Um, didn't make it too far because I think I just kind of petered out. I was like, this is too much for me transitioning from school to that. So took a little hiatus, went back home for a little bit. Then I actually got picked up for a hotshot crew and I came back out to Montana. I worked in fire for a season doing hotshot work across the West. And then after that, I ended up getting a full-time job in industrial forestry, actually in northern New England. And that's pretty, I mean, doing hardwood industrial forestry is in uneven age management and all the things related to that. That is a very artful skill set to do that because it's not doesn't work like it is in the West where it's cut it, plant it, harvest again. It's completely different sort of operation. So then through a couple other series of things and windy stuff, I ended up at the Washington Department of Natural Resources. And that was where I started my job there as state lands, as a state lands forester here in Olympia and Capital State Forest. And that was a really excellent learning ground for me to come into the Northwest sort of forestry scene. And basically from there, through a series of steps, thinking I was going to be I was going to be a forest practices forester, right? That's what a lot of people think when they come into the DNR because it's a great job to do that. Pretty cool gig. But through, again, a series of events, I actually ended up landing in our legislative group through some interesting connections with people. And then that took me on this really different route that I hadn't really ever thought I was going to go on, which was being involved in sort of policy development, and legislative affairs, and doing a lot of strategic work with the state forester, as well as our policy director. And during that time, we also had our transition of our commissioner, and went from Peter Goldmark to Hillary Franz, who's our current commissioner. And in the middle of all that stuff, the whole good neighbor thing kind of came into play around 2016, 2017. And so basically, I don't want to say like the rest is history, but we got that going. And so here I am today running this good neighbor thing for the agency. And so it's not been boring. I'll tell you that. So that's kind
Yeah,
of a,
that sounds like a pretty fascinating career trajectory, especially the bouncing back and forth from the east to the west. So, do you still, with that background in sugar maple syrup production, are you tracking any of the big leaf maple sugar maple syrup production things that the extension office and others is central for, and others are trying to do up in Whatcom County?
I've looked at it and I've been scratching my head going, "Oh, that's a lot of sap. That is a lot of sap for the amount of volume of sap you would need to create a product." That's the thing I've just looked at. The reason they do sugar maple is the sugar content of the sap and all that. And I am fascinated by it because anything you can pull from a tree, like a product like that, that's, renewable from the tree, I think is amazing. So, hey, if there's something for it and people are interested, it may just be a hobby thing, but I think it's cool. It's kind of like
Yeah,
birch.
I,
Yeah.
I'd say I actually prefer the taste of big leaf maple syrup to the traditional Northeast New
Oh
England
man,
maple syrup.
careful.
So,
Careful who you're talking to. That's like, I used to drink that stuff.
oh, I would trust me, and might get myself in trouble with the maple syrup mafia or something. So,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
so yeah, so I think you and I crossed paths in state lands. We worked in different districts, but we all kind of floated across district boundaries at times. But I'd say we really kind of got more engaged once the Good Neighbor Authority was signed, which for folks that don't know, that is a federal program that came out of the, oh boy, was it 2014 Farm Bill initially?
Even earlier than that, but that's when it got permanently sort of set up in an authority. Yes.
Yes, and so now you kind of lead Washington's GNA program, which is, hopefully we won't drift into too many acronyms because I always get chewed out by, in various venues by people,
Yeah.
all of those, but GNA flows so much easier off the tongue than Good Neighbor Authority. So,
Oh yeah.
so now you kind of run that, and I know you've been involved from the very beginning of, even how does DNR even
Yeah.
accept money um, for the commercial aspect portions
Yes.
of it. So
Yes.
maybe you kind of talk a little bit about the broader what is Good Neighbor Authority and a little bit of his background. I mean, it sounds cool. Hey, you're helping out your neighbor, but what
Yeah.
is it that the program's intended to do?
Oh man, that's a great question. I will add we actually got really involved with the forest health work with our capital budget. That was the place that we really started working closely with each other. But that actually is what transitioned into Good Neighbor, was sort of the being involved in that policy space, because that's where Good Neighbor kind of sits, is in this policy world. But the cool thing is it really connects to the ground. So we so what is it? Well, it's an authority. That's what it is. It's a federal authority, and it is a very unique authority because and if you look up sort of what is the definition of authority, it's basically, it's the legal space to conduct something within the bounds of that authority. So there's a series of those types of things out there in the world, everything from the stewardship authority to good neighbor authority. And there's a few other ones, but those are the main ones in our space. And what's really unique about Good Neighbor was that when it originated, and this is I've not been able to find this. I really wish I could, because the original intent of it was actually quite brilliant, where somewhere, somehow in the federal government, they were looking at sort of their workforce capacity. They were looking at across at, right next door at state agencies doing work. And someone said, boy, they pretty much do what we do. Like, they do the same thing. Like, what if we allowed them to, so long as we're not violating any federal laws, what if we let them do that on our land? It accomplishes the same goal, the same outcome, right? And so the intent of it is, the feds have and when I say feds, I'm going to say the U.S. Forest Service and sort of our Bureau of Land Management, our federal partners that we work really closely with. They acknowledge they have um, a lot of process, a lot of red tape, if that's the kind of word you want to use for it, that they have to go through. And they saw that states were able to accomplish stuff just at a faster pace than they were, just because by the nature of how they're designed. When you're as big as an organization as the federal government is, there is just that there's process. There's things you can't cut through it, because it has to fit everywhere across the whole country, right? So um, what Good Neighbor did was they looked and they said, yeah, okay, can we do something like that? So they created this authority. They actually piloted it way back, like I think it's like 2002, 2003. That idea was actually there. They had a little like baby pilot proviso in one of the appropriations bills, like way back, and I think it was with either Colorado or Utah. I have to go check, but they uh, they allowed for that at a very small pilot level to work. And then there were a couple like spits and spurts through all that time, all the way up through to 2014. Now, uh, what makes Good Neighbor really unique is it has the mechanism that's we can use the state processes to accomplish this work. And it's very broad. It's restoration work. That's the really important thing to understand. It's not trust lands work. It's not uh, well, that's the key thing I'm going to use, because that's the closest thing to talk about. So what I mean by that is the intent is different, right? The outcome is different. We're not doing something to generate revenue for the trust. That is state lands, at least here in Washington, as well as other states. That's the purpose. Here we accomplish a restoration goal, which is basically fixing mistakes that were done in the past. Over harvesting or species composition, a lot of issues with roads, so many issues with roads. Good Neighbor gave states the ability to finally go look across the line and go talk to the federal partners on this thing that's just been sitting there for years, and go, hey, can we fix that? We'd like to fix that. And the authority gives states the space to do that. And the important thing to understand about Good Neighbor is, originally it was just states. Like, it was really looked at as a state-based authority, and that was kind of the space that it was given. Over time, it's morphed a little bit, and there's been some sort of additions to that with tribes and counties coming into the picture, which is also great. But your question about sort of what is Good Neighbor and what's the intent is, and I'm talking about a bunch of different things, and hopefully it's resonating. But so the intent is to get the work accomplished using another entity's mechanisms, right? Their processes, so long as it's not violating federal law. In particular, NEPA is the big space, the NEPA process and all the protections that come with it. So when we accomplish that work, we basically follow all of the same restrictions that would be accomplished by the federal government. But what we would do is we would use the contracting mechanism, or we would use our state resources or things like that to accomplish it. So you were still going to accomplish the exact same end result. We just do it through our means, which is just by nature a lot thinner of a document. Ella accomplishes all the same stuff. So, um, yeah, so that's kind of the very, very short description of it, but not very short. But
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's, a lot of it, I think, came out of a realization that, there was a lot of forest health, particularly out here in the West, wildfire issues that, while the fires and the forest health issues may be on federal land, they still impact, state, private lands, and actually, and just the air quality and everything else and all the negatives that go along with that. And, we can save the debate for later, but the in the early to mid 90s, we as a society kind of dismantled the Forest Service from being, an effective land manager by, a lot of the policies, which just required them to have less staff, which now that we ramped the workload back up, it was a slightly different workload, but we ramped it back up, but didn't really give them the staff. So, um, I think that that's really key, that, it provides expertise and access to capacity to do a lot of this needed work, whether it's aquatics or, terrestrial type stuff, and forest health, wildfire, the roads is a big one. One of these days, I'll still get my dream, hopefully, of a federal road maintenance and abandonment planning process like the state of Washington had for large large forest land owners. I think that would do a lot of good for society at large, whether you're the recreating public or the land managing public. But we'll see what happens if that one ever occurs. So,
yeah.
and of course, GNA we know is national, but kind of, can you speak a little bit to kind of what's going on in, what I would consider kind of the Pacific Northwest, or, the West, particularly, we can talk more in depth about Washington, but, we've got Oregon, Idaho, Montana, California. Kind of how is that playing out? And of course, the advantage that those states have is we still have a milling infrastructure and a logging infrastructure, because obviously GNA can be used in places like Colorado and Wyoming, but
Yeah,
the
yeah.
infrastructure isn't as robust there.
That's a great point. So what makes GNA unique in this part of the country is exactly like you said. We have that nexus of, we have a lot of public land, in particular federal lands, and then we have uh, an existing milling infrastructure, like you said, that has adapted through a lot of the policy changes over time since the 90s. So pretty refined and savvy with sort of managing kind of markets and all the things that you have to do to be successful in sort of challenging policy environments to receive logs. So one of the things that makes Good Neighbor unique was, in addition to someone in Congress saying like, "Oh, hey, like we should just let them do what they do on our side of the line because they can do it more efficiently, cheaper." They added into that this concept of, well, also, what if we let them retain the value of any logs through a commercial restoration project? And that is a really important aspect of it, because that revenue component of Good Neighbor is one of like the key facets of it, that when you have it, it's an amazing thing to have, because it allows for us to generate a funding source on site right there, and it doesn't go anywhere else. And that's, when you're asking about the broader sort of other states, that's one of the things that makes it unique out here, is we are all able to some extent fund ourselves to continue going with work. And that's great because a lot of other situations with working with our federal partners, it's a may we please have some federal funding to accomplish this work. We do that as well. We also receive federal funds through whether they're appropriated or grant funds that come in through our federal partners. We have that mixture of funding sources, and it allows for us to be very diverse and nimble to how we fund and accomplish our work. That's happening across all of those states, and uh, it's significant because one of the challenges with our, as we mentioned before, like our federal partners, they have a lot of process involved, yet they still have their own targets and accomplishments they have to achieve for the sort of bigger picture at the DC level. And when they are kind of their own worst enemy with being sort of caught up in a lot of challenges that they have internally, we're able to kind of come in and give a little bit of certainty for sort of that process for them to go. You can count on us for that work. We'll get that. We'll make sure that that gets done, and it's not being done in a way where we're saying that without consideration of all of those protections I spoke about. Like we have just a very efficient attitude for sort of how we work, and that's a state functionality that I'd say is pretty consistent across all the states that have timber programs. And the really unique thing about states with timber programs is that that teaches you the whole concept of kind of repercussions of not being successful because I like to say we eat from those receipts of the timber. And so that's a really that gives really good motivation to make sure that we're going to be successful and we're going to work through not really having our internal sort of challenges. We're going to make sure that we accomplish the goal we need to because that's our folks continue being funded to continue doing work and so that we can have project funding. Because there's a whole other thing that we do outside of the timber discussion, because let's make it really simple. We do commercial restoration projects. So that would be a project that has like a removal where we're having some sort of an economic component of, uh, you know, uh, getting out and actually putting out that some sort of a bid where there's a purchase component, things like that. I will illustrate that in places like Arizona, they also are using commercial projects, but they don't use that process because there's no industry. So they have to do logging jobs where they're basically doing a service contract to accomplish the work. And that's
which to point out, a service contract means rather than the Forest Service essentially getting paid for the timber or exchanging the timber for other non-commercial services, like you get to log this unit and in exchange you have to, create snags, do pre-commercial thinning work, that kind of stuff. Down in the Southwest, service contract, that means the Forest Service actually has to bring dollars to the table to hire somebody to do the work. So
yes,
and I think that's one of the beauties of GNA is that
yeah,
you are not only generating revenue, but then you can leverage those revenue dollars
correct,
into all the stuff that normally would cost a landowner to do rather than
correct.
get paid to do.
Yes, I never for a second take for granted the fact that we have that. We're unbelievably lucky to have that as a component of our function. We do so with in addition to these commercial, like we said service, but we just call them like non-commercial restoration projects. So that would be a project that is purely a paid for project. We'll either use revenue for that, or we have a small amount of state funding that we have, or we'll use appropriated funds if they're the right color of money for the project. So sometimes the Forest Service or BLM will be given funding for project work, but they may not have the skill set in their agency to do it. So they'll come to us sometimes and say, well, can you guys take on that component of the project? You guys have that skill set and it's still accomplishing the same goal. We're just using other capacity to do it. And so that's another really important point of this is, why is this thing happening? Well, you mentioned it a little earlier about sort of like the people component. That's one of the biggest things that is a challenge out there kind of across all of our land bases is having people that have knowledge and skill sets to accomplish this type of work in the woods. It's really hard to see that when, as you mentioned, like back post 1990s, you saw a really large workforce. And then there's been terms like, the fire fix and stuff like that that have come through Congress. And that was a change where they were a lot of their resource management uh, funding was going to fire. And that created sort of this very, very unbalanced level of we got to respond to fires in places where forest health is sort of an issue. And we've got kind of those larger sort of catastrophic wildfire situations occurring, like a lot of Eastern Washington and now even in Western Washington here in some places. And um, but they don't have the resource managers or the staffing needs and the expertise to deal with the stuff before the fire happens. And so that's where Good Neighbor is really coming into play is we're basically trying to get ahead of the problem now. And it's because we're bringing that, what I call like the whole, which is people that know how to get the work done and understand a lot of the complexities of doing a complex restoration project. We do pretty complex prescriptions for our commercial projects, but we have really skilled, what we call them restoration specialists. And they're a lot of them come from state lands, and we recalibrate them to sort of the NEPA world. And it's actually not a very hard transition for a lot of folks. And they actually really like it because they they're complex prescriptions. They're challenging to lay out, but the result is really cool when you see that. And that's something that we're getting a lot of satisfaction out of.
Well, and I think it's important for the audience to remember too that you're implementing NEPA decisions by the Forest Service, and maybe at some point, I know you've got staff that's helping with the NEPA analysis side of it, and we may even get to the point at some point where your staff will be actually doing the full NEPA analysis. But I think that's a key thing when I travel around and talk to various groups, particularly those who may not be as excited about commercial projects. I always try to make that point that this isn't like changing or sidestepping the NEPA or the National Environmental Policy Act process. It's it's still working on under that umbrella. It's just using different contracting tools to get it done, and those contracting tools a lot of times are simpler than uh, a 40-page DNR contract that gets the same work done as compared to a 300-page Forest Service contract.
Yeah,
There's the efficiency right there.
right.
Um,
I think it's it's pretty fascinating because the thing about when folks are talking when they see those timber projects and stuff like that, a lot of times I like to try to explain to folks that the especially with the federal land work is that is one of our most important tools we have, right? Without that equipment, without those skill sets, without those workers, it we lose the ability to address the need. And that's right, the whole purpose of NEPA, right? And the purpose of need, right? Literally just said it. But without people that know how to work in the woods with equipment, we are either going to see roads start failing more and more than they already are. We're going to see a lot of stand conditions really start degrading more. We're at a really important time, especially on federal lands, because of that 1990s timeline, especially here in the Northwest, where the the idea is that we need to sort of just like walk away from everything and just let it be. But we actually don't need to do that. We actually have a great opportunity to go in there and do a little bit of tweaking, and then we sort of step back because it's kind of like pruning a tree kind of thing or pruning a plant. The plant responds to that really well. So um, or you just go, well, we'll let it do its thing over the next 100+ years. And in that time, there's so many things that can happen. So why just walk away from it when we can do a little bit of tweaking to set it on a better trajectory? And that's the whole concept of restoration, right? Is to go in, try to address the issue so that it gets put on a path to being healthier. That could be west side, sort of, deep contiguous forests that haven't had any management, and all they're doing now is just reaching that point of mortality where they're just falling over and nothing. And that that's great if there's no other things in the area that kind of need response to that, because we have almost like a stagnation problem on the west side. And it's fascinating because you walk into these forests and you're like, this is beautiful, and then you sort of stop and listen and look around, and it's actually very kind of like a tree farm. If you've ever been on a tree farm where it's a monoculture and there's no understory, and the sole purpose is the basically the wood product. That's not what we try to do. We try to make that environment be very, very sort of diverse, especially ecologically. But you got to do that. Forests need a little bit of movement in them, right? And so that's the purpose of a fire. That's the purpose of a landslide. That's the purpose of all those things that open up the canopy, and that's kind of what we try to do. And on the east side, uh, of course, it's for sort of the fire risk reduction. We got a lot of issues now where we've got a lot of the pandemic kind of exacerbated this a little bit, where a lot of people move into these wonderful places to live, and for some reason humans like to live right in that perfect spot where it also happens to be like highly volatile for fire. And uh the expansion of kind of WUI stuff and sort of backing up against these federal lands and state lands and all these public lands is sort of everybody's dream, so they can have that big backyard. Yet when the fire starts, it's a different story. So being really strategic about sort of our energy to help, basically when there is a fire on federal lands, making sure that we're going to be able to do something so it doesn't threaten the homes that are down the hill. I mean, that's kind of unfortunately, that's a story that you hear way too many times about the fire starting up in the stand and then it kind of rolled down the hill with its inertia and just kept going into communities. Uh, that song has been sung so many times. So yeah, those are some
Yeah.
thoughts.
Well, I think you raised an interesting point too. There is that, I think a lot of people forget, not so much foresters, but I think a lot of people outside the forestry sector forget that these forests are dynamic. They're not static. That, while we may be here on this earth for 65 to 90, maybe 100 years old, if you got really good genetics, we're just seeing that little period of time. If you're, up looking at some of the massive old growth stands in, Mount Rainier National Park, and that when we've, as a human species, have managed these stands to just walk away from them, doesn't mean that they're going to turn into
No.
kind of the fairy tale image of old, really old forests. And I didn't think of, I know stands on the Olympic Peninsula that, due to lack of management, they're 80, 85 years old, and you can walk through them, they don't look any different than a 35-year-old stand, just because there's been, so much density that they've just basically kind of have shut down their growth. And until the natural mortality comes into it, or we come in and start to do some thinning and those types of things, those stands are going to stay in that, for decades until they start to differentiate. So, um, I think that's one of the key things. And of course, we have 100 years of fire suppression, so that changes dynamics as well. So, well, so I know that I believe you are the chair of the Western States State Foresters sub. Am I getting this
Yeah,
right?
no, you're good.
Subcommittee on Good Neighbor Authority,
Council of Western State
Council
Foresters,
of Western State
Good Neighbor
Foresters. Yes,
Authority.
I.
Yep.
And so you're the chair of that, and then uh, Kyle. All of a sudden, for some reason, it's been a long week. So all of a sudden,
I
Kyle's
know.
last Sullivan down in
Kyle,
Oregon.
yeah. Yep.
I believe he's part of that group, and then of
He's part of
course
the leadership team. Yep. Yep.
you've got counterparts also in Idaho and Montana, and so
Yeah.
I assume you kind of have a pretty good network of where the different states get together, talk about what's going
Yeah.
on. what's
Yeah,
working, what's not working. Of course, then you have the differences of all your different state processes, but
yeah, yeah. I think that's yeah. So as part of that role, so that committee was originally a task force because the crazy thing about Good Neighbor is the timeline. It's existed. I mean, you say things kind of got cooking around 2016, 2017. That is not that long ago for this thing to develop. You know, it the interesting thing is Good Neighbor really took off in actually Wisconsin out of all places because Wisconsin like they had a really sort of wherewithal to think about this sort of revenue thing and how that worked. And they actually partnered up with counties as one of their main resources to do a lot of this work. And that has just had a huge boost in sort of a lot of the restoration efforts on, I believe they just have one national forest out there. So you come out to the West where it's a whole bunch of national forests and it's just sort of an exponential effect when we meet every month and we talk about a lot of the challenges we're dealing with, a lot of it's related to like how because it's so new, there's a lot of things that are still being figured out. So we do a lot of sharing about how we navigated something. You know, do we need? I mean, it sounds kind of boring, but it's like, do we need a process for that? Like that's one of those things because it's great to get going, just kind of on sort of moxie and gumption, but eventually, you know, you got to kind of pull back and go, let's get this a little bit more lined out. So all the states are kind of in this unique um, sort of moment when they're really working on sort of maturing and having a lot of sort of like formalized things in place for them. I know, are spending a lot of effort trying to sort of go back and look at what we've done and go, okay, how can we do it better? How can we do it more consistently? How can we do it more efficiently? Are there things we can do to improve on the way that we operate and execute our work? Um, and so all the states, you know, there's about 12 or 13 states that are regular participants. All the states you mentioned from the Northwest and sort of along the West Coast, but also the Southwest and Intermountain Rockies. And they're all very, you know, basically relatable to the public lands and national forest systems that exist within those areas. Now, what's really unique is that this thing we do looks different in every single state. Like there is some consistency, but like the quote that our people always laugh at me about say GNA is a goldfish and it fits the tank it's given. Like you can't force it to be what it is here in Washington down in New Mexico. Like it just the environment and the like both the ecological environment as well as the sort of social environment and what drives the things in those regions is completely different. So um, again, we're really lucky that we were able to take advantage of that sort of the industry and timber component to allow us to develop that funding source for the work. But other states are relying either on predominantly state funding or they're relying on federally appropriated funds to come through for them. The wildfire crisis strategy that was put out here about 2 or so years ago was a really big boon for a lot of states to get them going because they didn't really have good state support for funding, and yet there was a desire to do it. And it's just trying to figure out how do you get it going. It's a very common thing all the states deal with is like how do you get it moving? And once it gets moving, it actually takes off pretty good because what starts happening is progress really, and progress as a broad stroke statement. People really support that stuff that they've been trying to do for 12 years gets done in 3 months. People get pretty excited when that happens, and we've done that. I've lost count how many times where we just said we'll just take care of that, and they go, "You can't, you can do that." Like, yeah, no, we'll get that. 3 days later, it's done, and it's been sitting there for 3 years, and that's a cool feeling to see sort of broad stroke across all of the interested parties and the public that response and in return or another sort of result of that is the Forest Service and our other federal partners with the BLM, they get excited too because it gives them a sense of progress, and that's pretty neat to see that.
yeah, no, that's pretty cool. So in your work with other states, do you see that I know at least in my experience here in Washington, there was initially a lot of education needed to be done with the legislature because I mean, your state, state programs oftentimes funded at least partially with state dollars. So is there like the need for ongoing education with state legislative bodies, those type of things, or
It's again, I would say it's a state by state thing. And what's really interesting is here in Washington, again, right? It's the place that that agency fits in the state. It's typically the forestry or the wildlife agency that is being uh, sort of the venue for this right now. As I said, counties and tribes are coming in. The every state's a little different. Some states it's a governor initiative. The governor wants it, and the governor is pushing it, so that has that trickle down effect of a lot of interest. Here in Washington, with our sort of commissioner of public land structure, we operate very differently because we're an independently elected state, our official that runs our agency. So that was a thing that she just did and just wanted to do. And so it stayed kind of within our space. Yet we partner with other agencies as we do it. And that's what really drives it. In some states have a sentiment where they really are frustrated with federal land management and they really push sort of that they trust states more, even though sometimes that drives me bonkers because there's a lot of good people that work in federal government to do amazing work and amazing jobs at what they do. And it's just that perception of federal government versus state government. And we deal with it sometimes, but it's the big thing to know is that we can't do this without our federal partners. Uh, so every state's a little different with how they are approaching it. And what seems to happen with it is there's an initial, like a lot of interest in it, and then it just kind of becomes a little bit more routine, and it's not really super scary anymore, or there aren't a lot of questions. And the thing about it is we're very open with sort of what we do. So we always encourage folks to ask questions and we'd love to walk them through it because it's a really unique thing in itself, that operating space. I call it the big W we because it's acknowledging like, well, I can't really do it alone anymore. We need some help. So
yeah, no, I agree. It's kind of one of those things that it's like, how can you be against it? I remember that when the state was getting ready and Commissioner Franz was getting ready to sign the Good Neighbor Authority, that there was a group of us who realized, well, the state's going to actually need to have an account to put this money into, and the first attempt at creating that account was for full disclosure, was led by my employer, the large landowner association, the Nature Conservancy, and you know that bill, it traditionally you don't necessarily have people wanting to sign on to it to help sponsor it after the bill's been introduced. But I mean, the bill was introduced and we had people calling up, can I put my name on that? And it didn't matter what party they were in. They just were like, this is cool because it's going to be something that can actually be a net positive for the state in so many different ways. So
yeah,
I know there was a little hiccup there, but you did some great work the next legislative session and got that approved. And so how does or what does GNA kind of look like here in Washington? Because it's I've had the fortune of being able to kind of watch it grow. Try to work with you and the rest of the DNR staff involved in, what does a contract even look like? I remember that
yeah.
first one of, um, okay, the AG's
Head
rep put
scratching. That's a
porta
good one.
potties
Yeah.
as a requirement in Northeast Washington in January when the temperature is likely going to be 10 degrees,
Yep.
and all
Yep.
those kind of fun things. So,
Yeah.
so how is kind of GNA evolved and what does it mean here specifically in Washington?
Oh yeah. Well, here in Washington, one of the things we started with an idea that this was going to be an integrated with our state lands design, right? So we were going to have uh, small groups that were a part of our existing state lands regions, and they would be kind of their own little thing within those regions. And then as we started moving along, we realized that no matter what we're going to do, state lands priorities were always going to take a priority, even though we knew that this was really important because it's like really big picture important. Um, they're statutorily required to do what they do, so that by nature is going to take priority. And so what it looks like now is we actually have a fully dedicated organization that sort of channels up through sort of my position in our forest resilience division. And it's not deprioritized because we this is all we do. This is our sole purpose is to do this work. So that's been a big thing that's kind of come into light recently where we knew we needed to make that move. So the benefit of that is that we've developed basically three very distinct functions within our group. So we have an operations group that does a lot of the commercial work as well as the non-commercial restoration projects, a lot of really large fuels reduction projects across every forest in Washington. We have the one of the very unique things about Washington is we have a dedicated engineering group within our ranks, and that's I think we're the only state that has that, and that's in thanks to DNR state lands because they had their own engineering group that we were able to kind of learn from and sort of be fostered under. And we basically work closely with the broader engineering group within the agency, but we're recalibrated for what the federal lands needs are. And then the last group you mentioned it earlier is sort of we one of the unique things that came out of the 1168 funding for that was put into play here last biennium, and that's our long-term forest health funding bill that came into play was actually creating a dedicated small environmental planning team that is going to help accomplish NEPA. We're also the only state that's doing that too. So we have our own biologist, we have our own archaeologist, we have uh, seasonal techs that are going out there to help conduct a lot of these surveys, and it's been pretty phenomenal. That's like kind of our new area that we're really starting to understand more. And what does it look like? We are really focusing our energy on, again, it's like figuring out how those skill sets and those expertise fit into our federal partners' work plan and how that can be very consistent so that when they're trying to accomplish their goals, they're considering sort of our energy and capacity in that process. And in the hope that what will end up happening as a result is it does kind of like a full sort of leveling up for the whole thing. Because if we free up their time and we're taking care of this work over here, they can go over here and take care of that thing. That's happened. I mean, I say that happens every single day. And then going forward from there, you know, we've now sort of moving into kind of a new space with that committee where we're actually trying to explore sort of sharing resources interstate because again, we're pretty uniquely specialized groups that work in this NEPA environment, know a lot of sort of the restrictions, and we have to work under ESA. We have to work under all those things that state lands, at least here in Washington, is they're through their HCP process, right? So it's different how they do it. So what we're looking at is how we can share resources to get some of those states sort of moving a lot more that are struggling because they just don't have anybody to get the work done. They might have one person. So that's a new space that's on the horizon. It's pretty exciting because I think people see the benefit of that. And so we're just kind of beginning to tiptoe into that to understand what that looks like. But the future, my hope is that the future is that as tribes and counties come into play more, there is a really good sort of intertwining of these different groups and what they can bring to the table to support the big need, which is our federal partners. They kind of the way to think about federal lands is a broad stroke statement is it's kind of like somebody at one point in time had a full family in a big house and it was just rocking. It just had so much going on. And then at some point in there, a bunch of those people left the house and the house is still there. And it's starting to kind of fall apart because we're not maintaining it. And so what we're kind of doing is, they're there and they're doing their best they can, but they're calling in the painters and they're calling in the carpenters and all those sort of things. And hopefully what we can do is help get those homes looking better. And by the homes, I mean our federal land bases. So that's kind of that's what I hope, something like that's what it's going to look like.
I think that's great. Sorry, I just was trying to pull up really quick. I should have done this earlier, but just kind of an indication of the program. I see that in your 2023 report, that since 2019, you've done what, 8,600 acres of commercial treatments, a little over almost 10,500 acres of non-commercial. So that's both fuels reduction, PCT work, which helps with
Yeah,
forest health, those type of things. Um, you've done 61 aquatic improvement projects. So, that can be road decommission, well, decommissioning separate, but addressing fish barriers,
yeah,
anything that has negative water impacts. This is a big one, 287 miles of deferred road maintenance. So, I mean,
yeah,
you've got a pretty big footprint, and brought in $8.5 million in outside revenue in addition to, state and federal funding. So, I think here in Washington, it's been a pretty good program. I think I would say, at least from my perspective, you've got broad acceptance and interest from all of the national forests here in Washington. In fact, I know a few of them would like to see more of your staff doing good work, and so I think it's a good program, and I think you and DNR have shown that really kind of building those coalitions, because there are a lot of folks probably more concerned about the commercial side of it that were kind of sort of naysayers or just cautious, and you know a lot of them have become strong advocates for the program. So I think overall it's been good, and I think being able to fill those capacity holes on the forest, especially the engineering side of, I mean, he's if you were just going into college about 5 years ago, forest engineering would have been a great place, because they're in high demand right now. Now, of course, 8, 10 years from now, after more engineers have gone into the field, who knows? But no, I think that's been really good. What other kind of challenges do you see for the Washington program coming up here in the
yeah.
near future? And then after that, what opportunities?
I think one of the biggest challenges that's coming up is just there's as you move into sort of the routine is what I'll call it, where it's very consistent and it's just sort of normalized. I think like any other entity, whether you're federal or state, it's kind of looking out on the horizon and going like, where's funding for this coming from? How will it maintain? And then a big question is sort of like, where's the line, right? Where do we sort of stop this? And we don't need to continue growing or expanding. That's like an existential question. I think a lot of states deal with at a certain point. I think that the I'll be just to be candid, the policy landscape in the federal world is there's a lot of stuff happening right now, which is causing a lot of sort of like I don't know what the future looks like for doing sort of veg management on federal lands. And that's a thing that again, because we eat from those receipts, is something that we're just kind of trying to understand and trying to plan for. I think a big question for me is sort of like, what do our federal partners want this to look like, in the future? Um, and furthermore, like, what does the public want it to look like? I think the states and other entities supporting the federal sort of need is something that a very small demographic of folks really actually understand that concept, because a lot of people when they go into a federal land base, they're like, I don't know who owns this. It's just I just isn't everything the national forest, when you and I know that's not the truth, right? So um I do think there's going to be a lot more of that demographic, the bigger demographic, sort of climate and a lot of those things really come into play as they already are right now. The understanding of how valuable our federal land bases, our national forests and Bureau of Land Management land bases, and all of our federal land bases are, because they're honestly one of like our country's most valuable assets, right? Just for many, 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 many reasons. And I think there's going to be bigger interest from that demographic, which I think is great because I think the hardest part about natural resources is that it's often taken for granted and people just kind of don't care about it until it's something that's in their face, whether it's a fire or suddenly something happened to their drinking water or fish, or they can't catch any fish because there's no fish to catch because there was nowhere for fish to spawn. Like those are things that are, as a forester and you with your background in forestry, like we think about that stuff all the time, but we're a very small demographic. And again, we think decadally. That's not normal thinking for people. Like people, I'm thinking about, what's the next month look like for me? Maybe than just the next week. We're focused on, 50, 100 years into the future. And so I don't know if the world will ever get to a point that everyone thinks like that, but I think foresters and natural resource managers, as climate becomes a higher priority for the overall population, maybe people will start looking to us a little bit more, which will be interesting. And then follow through with that is the largest land bases are federal lands, and people really trying to understand what those are.
Yeah, no, I I don't disagree with you. I think that's one of our challenges is, our society and culture, at least here in the US, is, you know, tends to not look at that longer range and tends to not want to address issues until they smack you in the face like wildfire smoke. And unfortunately, then when the wildfire smoke drifts away, we go back to worrying about other things. So, maybe less of a macro, more of a micro scale. Are you finding challenges like a lot of other entities looking for employees, housing challenges, those type of things? Because you're tending to try to find people who want to live in rural communities.
Yeah. I think it doesn't matter who you work for or what you do. That's a big problem. Um, we work on the Olympic Peninsula, which is by nature, it has an isolation component to it because of just geographically how it's designed. And we've been unbelievably lucky to have a really good team form out there. But leading up to that team, we had the same sort of issue where people couldn't find housing. And that's not unique to us. We work in some pretty far away places like Northeast Washington, but one of the benefits we have is the way we structure the program is that we have people that cover a whole forest, so we give people a lot of latitude for where they can look for housing so long as they're able to get to the places they need to be within that geography. And that's been a big benefit versus saying you have to work in this tiny little box and find housing, because we know that that's a challenge. So that's one of the benefits to being in like a large sort of spatial setting. Then there's a lot of drawbacks to that too, because I mean it's a lot of driving to get to project areas.
Yeah, no, I mean, I hear that from really just about everybody, that challenge. So, um, any like kind of near term opportunities?
Yeah, there's I think near-term opportunities for us is really leaning into partners and looking at opportunities to bring them kind of into this space, especially tribal partners and county partners that are interested. We see ourselves sort of playing a really important role in helping educate folks about sort of what we've gone through, even though they're going to have their own sort of journey with this thing when they go on it. There's a lot of just like you got to understand this part of the federal process to understand how this thing works. And we've gone through a lot of that ourselves. And I think there's an important role that states, especially more established states, are going to need to play to just be more of mentors and helping advise. And helping those other entities stand up as they come into play because uh, it's not for everyone. I'm just going to be really clear. Like saying I'm going to go work in the federal process is like not for everyone, especially if you're used to just doing stuff extremely quick and fast, or however you want to do it. That's not how it works when you work with our federal partners. We have to respect that space, and it means you just have to adjust your expectations a little bit. And I'll give you like a really simple example on that is state lands, timber sale contract is 2 years. And what we found is that because of the process we work in, working under NEPA, our contracts have to be 4 years in order to give the contractor enough time to accomplish the work. That was a big realization that came into play. So I just sort of throw that out there for folks who are interested in it and they want to get into it. Just it doesn't mean I just get to go do whatever we want. It's adjusting how you do to fit that space. That's really what it is.
Yeah. Well, I think it will continue to evolve. It will continue to be interesting to watch. I think it'll be good. Hopefully, Congress doesn't mess it up somehow. But no, well, thank you. I think this has been good. Is there any last words, or where can folks go to learn more about GNA or more specifically Washington's Good Neighbor
Yeah,
Authority program?
you can come to the DNR website, and we actually have it's dnr.wad.gov/GNA. Or a great place to go is actually the Council of Western State Foresters or Western Forestry Leadership Coalition. That's where their GNA resource website lives, and that is an unbelievable resource that I always direct people to because it gives you exposure to all the states doing the work because it's a big compilation of all those different things. There's examples of sort of project examples and spotlights, and you can get sent to all the other states pages if they have them, and then just a lot of FAQ sort of stuff, frequently asked questions. Great resource for the public and for interested parties.
Well, cool. Thank you. I will make sure I put those links into the show notes. And this has been fun. We may have to do another more in-depth conversation in the future and kind of get an update on the program. And of course, those of us here in Washington that are very interested in the program will, now that the latest legislative session is adjourned, I'm sure about June or July, we'll be starting to ramp up all the work to make sure that you have all the resources needed to keep pushing forward and keep the GNA staff doing great work.
That sounds great. And I'm again, thank you for having the chance to come and sit down. I love to talk about this stuff because I believe in it and am passionate about it. All the people that work in it are passionate about it because uh, it's an amazing feeling to feel like you're making a difference. And that's what a lot of our people really glom onto is that ability to make a positive change. And it's felt broadly. It's very, very, very cool and very rewarding.
Well, cool. Thank you. And we will look forward to future conversations.
All right. Thanks a lot, Matt.